Hello, and welcome back to Season 2, Episode 120 of Paranormal NL Podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Pocket Cast, and YouTube. I'm your host, Jen. A big shout out tonight to who introduced me to tonight's guest. Let's give a big shout out to Eric Freeman Simms with the Night House in Kentucky with the Unseen Paranormal and Strangely Haunted. Eric was on PNL Podcast Season 2, Episode 55. Now, tonight I decided to switch it up a bit and do an impromptu collab with Joe De Hoyos from Texas, USA, who was on PNL Podcast Season 2, Episode 103, to help interview tonight's guest via phone. Now, we'll introduce the guest shortly, but now it's time to pull up your cozy chair and listen in to your favorite podcast. Paranormal NL Podcast is a place where the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada, and anywhere else in the world can share their paranormal experiences. PNL Podcast also believes in supporting people, places, and things to promote paranormal tourism and paranormal networking all over the world. A big thank you again to all the PNL Podcast alumni guests from Season 1 and 2, and of course our fans. We want to hear your stories. Do you have any paranormal, supernatural, metaphysical, UFO, cryptid creatures, folklore, historical, books, or just tales of the weird you'd like to share as a guest on my PNL podcast? Please reach out to me on Facebook, Instagram, or Gmail at paranormal.nl.podcast@gmail.com. After your episode, you'll become part of the PNL Podcast Alumni Network. Make sure you click on the link or click on the bell and subscribe to follow along on whatever platform you're listening in on to like and get new updates for new episodes. Head on over to Facebook and join our group, the Paranormal NL Podcast group, where you can find upcoming new PNL episodes in the featured section of the group. We're listening to our fans. PNL is now on YouTube and Instagram and now has a Facebook page for fans who are not on Instagram for Instagram drops and a spot for the PNL Bog Team Investigation Facebook Go Lives. That's right. We now have a new branch of Paranormal NL Podcast with the PNL Bog Team, a boots-on-the-ground investigation team doing local historical investigations in Newfoundland and Labrador. Our fans asked us Paranormal NL Podcast merch, and the new PNL Bog Team merch is now available on TeePublic. Now let's get on with the show tonight. I have on the phone with me a gentleman who I'd like to introduce, and his name is Mr. Joel Stern, and he's from Pennsylvania, United States. He's a linguist, a translator, and he translated the book, The Elusive Force. Welcome, Mr. Stern.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be your guest tonight.
I'm also going to add on the stage here, we have Mr. Joe De Hoyos. Again, he's a host from Beyond the Woodline Podcast from Texas. Welcome, Joe. De Hoyos, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me on again. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for doing this impromptu here with Mr. Stern. So without further ado now, Mr. Stern, can you tell me a little bit about how you got into translating this book, The Elusive Force?
Well, it's the beginning of a 34-year odyssey, I would describe it. Back in late 1988, I was working as a staff translator in the Office of Language Services at the U.S. State Department in Washington. I specialized in Slavic languages, mostly Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian, although I can read some others. I also dabble in Hungarian, German, and a little bit of Romanian at the time. So how did I find out about the Lasha Gajewski case, which is the subject of the book, The Elusive Force? Well, as I mentioned, 1988, I happened to meet a Polish couple who immigrated from Warsaw. This was in Northern Virginia at the time, and the husband, Vyacheslav Yurkus, was a bioenergy therapist, and his wife, Margaret, was a journalist
I'm going to hold, Mr. Stern, I'm going to hold up the book. I know you can't see because you're on the phone, but I'm holding up the book. This
Sure.
is The Elusive Force. This is the book, and I'm going to move it here in the front so folks can see it. A remarkable case of poltergeist activity and psychokinetic power. And again, you translated it. And I wanted to also say, before we move along, how to pronounce the name of the girl in the book. And
Well, her formal name was Joanna Gajewska, but nobody called her by her formal name. She was always Joasha.
Joasha.
Sort of like Joni in English,
Right.
Diminutive form.
Okay.
And to simplify matters and to avoid gender confusion, I used the last name Gajewski, although in original Polish it's Gajewska. We can't distinguish between, masculine and feminine last names in English, so I had to, do a little bit of simplification. So that's how to pronounce her name.
Right. Yeah. And, I'll let you continue, and then I guess I can start to ask you a few different questions, and I'll hold up a picture of her. There's a picture of Joasha there.
Right. Very good.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So tell me a little bit more about her. From what I read in the book, we're talking a lot about the branch of science known as parapsychology, and we're talking about ESP, like psychokinesis, poltergeist activity, things like that. So, I mean, when you think about stuff like that, a lot of things come to mind. One of the other pictures I wanted to hold up was a picture. It says credit of Mr. Stern. You can see Joasha on the left and her parents in the picture also. How did you come across the picture? Did you get to meet her?
Well, I took that photograph myself. I met her, Joasha's and her parents twice, shortly after I finished translating the book in the summer of 1989. I should go back and expand on that because I didn't finish my original thought. Let me backtrack a little bit. Margaret Vierkus, the journalist, told me about this book. She said that an American publisher might be interested in having it translated into English because the subject matter was so fascinating. And I read the book, and I myself was just completely fascinated by the girl's story. I don't think it was sensationalistic journalism, that it sounded totally genuine and objective to me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have undertaken the project.
Right.
So that's how I found out about the book.
Okay.
It took me roughly 8 or 9 months to translate it. Unfortunately, Margaret Vierkus' claim that an American publisher might be interested turned out to be untrue, but I'm going to skip over that rather unpleasant episode. To answer your question, I did meet the girl shortly after I translated the book. This was in the summer of 1989.
Okay.
I got in contact with the authors, the co-authors actually, Marek Ramushko and his wife, Anna Osticka, both well-known investigative journalists who lived in Warsaw.
Now, when you...
I knew Polish, that certainly facilitated our contact, and I visited the authors in October of 89.
Now, 89, Mr. Stern, that was after her puberty, correct? After when...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, she was 19, so that was...
And the reason...
At least several years after,
Yes.
after the stage of puberty, yes.
Now, the reason why I say that is it's significant about her age, because during the book and afterwards, a lot of the doctors and physicists and whatnot, they theorize that during the age of puberty, when all the hormones are going around, especially with a female, that this may cause, or might be, that's one of the theories of the the powers that she had.
It's certainly one of the most prevalent theories to explain poltergeist activity, but I think it would be a stretch to claim that it explains every
Right.
single case. We can go into that later.
Right. So
she was past the stage of puberty.
Right. When
I
you
first met her.
did you see or experience anything similar to?
She met. I visited her in October of '89 and also in the summer of 1990. And on each occasion, she bent a steel spoon for me right before my eyes.
So
just by rubbing it with one finger for a couple of minutes. And I kept both spoons as souvenirs of my soul paranormal experience.
That was going to be my next question about the spoons. Were they easily malleable, or?
No, well, look, they're bent like pretzels, and I cannot unbend them, and I doubt, frankly, that even the strongest man in the world can straighten them out. So if certainly they're not malleable now, and I don't know how she did it, but the spoons started drooping after a couple of minutes of her rubbing them, and they became grotesquely twisted.
Wow. So you were able to experience that.
I observed her very carefully. This is right in front of her bedroom door.
Right. Thanks for sharing that. And was there any other things that you saw that she did or anything while you were there?
Well, I was not a direct eyewitness of any psychokinetic or poltergeist activity. However, I did see many traces of, let's say, destructive effects in the family's apartment. Dented walls, all over the place. It looked pretty battered.
Yes, and for Mr. De Hoyos who's listening, some of the examples of things that happened were, shattered glass, things unexplainably going through solid objects and reappearing or rematerializing in other rooms. Really weird things, and they were typical people. They lived in a little apartment on the first floor of a building. Her mom was a telephone operator, dad was a plumber, and the people upstairs, like within minutes after this happening, the family got scared and ran upstairs to them. And they came downstairs and they say that they witnessed things flying around themselves. Police officers witnessed it. Nurses, doctors, like people who are reputable people who who are credible, who you wouldn't think would say these things, came forward and said that they witnessed these things in the house.
Well, they're cited by name in the book.
Yes.
Including very highly regarded scientists,
yes.
physicians, psychologists. They were staking their reputation at risk to their own career. So I doubt very much they were colluding in some sort of gigantic hoax.
Right.
And we can discuss the various criticisms of this case, of which I've encountered quite a few.
Right. And this all happened in the 80s, right, Mr. Stern?
Well, the case continued for 7 years, from the spring of 1983 to sometime in 1990.
Yeah.
Not long after I paid them my second visit.
Oh, you went back for a second time?
Yeah, I mentioned that she bent a spoon for me in the summer of 1990 when I paid the family's second visit. Yes.
Okay, right. And did you hear any of the crackling or like the...
No, I did not myself. No, not when I was there.
Okay,
no.
Mr. De Hoyos...
I did speak to 2 eyewitnesses.
Okay.
Friends of Urasha who had been struck by flying objects.
Now, Mr. De Hoyos has a question for you, Mr. Stern.
Sure.
And I'll translate it over to you because of the way we're doing this technologically.
Was she ever able to affect a person? Like she's bending spoons. Was she able to,
He's wondering, Mr. Stern, Mr. De Hoyos is wondering, was Yuasha able to affect other humans? Now, from what I read in the book, it was mostly
By
objects.
what do you mean by affect other humans? There were people, let's say classmates and strangers, who were injured by objects that she caused to move psychokinetically.
Right,
Obviously, she did not do this deliberately to her friends, but there were people who were physically injured, yes.
right.
Even her parents occasionally were victims of these, what we call poltergeist manifestations.
Right, and she actually got hurt herself a few
Yes,
times.
many times by flying glass and other, objects hurtling through the air. So, was she deliberately doing this to attract publicity, to her case? And why should she deliberately hurt herself for this purpose? I mean, it strains my credulity.
Well, I was thinking kind of about that too when I was reading it. Okay, typical teenager mad at her mom. It did say in there that her mom had a high level of anxiety, but it
Yes.
said that it was always because of, what happened and what was going on. So it's hard to say, teenagers will be teenagers. But some of the things that happened were the temperature. When you touched that spoon after she bent it, was it hot?
Something frankly, I don't remember, but I don't recall it being hot to the touch. No.
Okay.
At least not in my case. Now, I'm not saying it in every occasion that this did not happen. I think some researchers did find an increase in the temperature of the object. There was mention in the book that her father caught this flying bottle in midair and it burned his fingers.
Yes.
If you recall that
I do.
episode. But,
Yeah. And she also had some fevers. Her temperatures fluctuated
her temperatures often fluctuated
between like 40, which is 104
She would complain of
Fahrenheit.
having a very high fever, but the thermometer did not measure an abnormally high temperature.
No, yeah, when they put it under her
There were all
arm.
these anomalies,
Right.
found by the researchers that are still a mystery.
And she was also, they made her wear clothing that were
yes.
lower static electricity, like,
Right,
woolen
exactly.
garments, trying not to wear wool or things like that.
Yes, that was one precaution taken to minimize, the effects.
And people would joke and say, like, careful when you shake
Right.
Yoasha's hand, you'll get a jolt. Now, were you able to shake her hand or?
Well, I'm sure I did, but I didn't feel any jolt.
No. Yeah. So, yeah, moving on, there's so many different things that happened. I mean, there were so many different witnesses. There was plates and glasses flying, a lot of different things. Then the city actually moved them out into a different home, and it happened
Yes,
in a different
She
place.
was living in the town of Sosnowiec, which is in southwestern Poland, not too far from the Czech border. And the municipal authorities who thought the girl and her family were perpetrating a hoax, they investigated this case, and they soon saw for themselves that this was no, publicity stunt, but the phenomena were genuine and causing a great deal of damage. So, as a possible solution, they moved the family to another studio apartment in the town of Chelaj, which is not far away, in the hope that, all this would die down and everything would be, nice and calm again. But
Right. The police officers.
That did not prove to be the case.
Yeah, the police officers from a nearby station inspected the apartment, but later they thought there was some kind of a hoax being perpetrated. And they were kind of making fun of her in the news, and her her friends in school, but she complained of unexplained headaches. And like we talked about the temperature, 104.9, which would be 40.5 Celsius. And then they would check like under her armpit and it'd be abnormally low. So within the same couple of minutes. And there was another thing about the things flying and the objects, like they couldn't see them fly until they hit what they were
Generally, that
going
was
at.
true.
Couldn't see the object until they
They
dropped.
were moving
Hoyos?
so fast, far more quickly than a human hand could have thrown them, according to the researchers. They were just a blur.
And the objects from other rooms would appear from different rooms.
And not only that, the size of the object was often disproportionate to the sound, the acoustic result. In other words, a light bulb or a cup would smash against the wall, and it would sound like an imploding TV tube. A tremendous bang, all out of proportion to the size of the object. That was another curious feature of the case.
Yeah, the police report actually stated unequivocally that inexplainable physical phenomena involving the spontaneous movement of objects. The municipal authorities, they sent in like a chief architect from the Department of Urban Planning and inspected the building. It was a 30-year-old building, apartment building. There was no defects in the construction. There was no reason for things to be tipping over. Like there wasn't on a bad fault line. The architect advised authorities, like you said, that she needed other lodgings, but they still followed her wherever she went. And even
there were a lot of hypotheses put forward.
We get another question from Mr. De Hoyos here for you, Mr. Stern.
I'm just wondering how many, well, not how many, but how high up the chain it went as far as the government goes. I know like local police were involved, right? Like, did anybody else
Local
higher ever
police were
come?
involved, and he's asking about how high up the chain it went. In Poland, right, Mr. Stern, it went pretty far up because we had nuclear physicists, we had all kinds of people.
By high up the chain, what does he mean by
He
that?
means government-wise.
Well, the Ministry of Health was
Minis-
informed of this case. There were many, there were several institutes of nuclear physics. There was an institute of welding technology and metallurgy. How high up the chain did it go? Well, I don't know if I can answer that question with full specificity, but there were quite a few prominent specialists who learned about the case and eventually took part in researching it.
A lot of interdisciplinary research people.
Yes, several teams of interdisciplinary,
So unfortunately, they divulged the address of where she lived by mistake, and quote unquote by mistake. But now all these people showed up at the door. Like people wanted to do exorcists, and psychics wanted to communicate with the spirit world, and Catholics and parish priests. Father Schmuck was there, and he offered up invocations of their haunted home, which failed, and stuff like this, right? The observed effects were, they maybe thought it was heavy irradiation or radiation.
Well, as I mentioned, there were a number of hypotheses put forward in the course of this research.
A lot, yeah.
And they're set forth in detail in the last two appendices of the book.
Right.
Which we can discuss if you want to.
We can, yeah. And it happened in the day and night, even when she was sleeping.
Regardless of the time of day, regardless of the weather.
And it didn't matter.
In other words, there was really no predictability.
Right. And it could be any kind of object. It could be wooden, plastic, metal, anything.
Yes.
And nobody could see it until it was like a split second.
There were a few exceptions. If you recall in the book, there was a cup of tea that kind of floated in the air without spilling a drop of liquid.
Right.
That was strange,
But no, she did complain of health problems, particularly headaches, but no tangible reason, and temperatures. But also, the bath thermometer. They had to use a bath thermometer because the scale on the medical thermometer didn't go high enough. And during the EKG exam, the glass pane of the control panel and the apparatus cracked.
Oh,
Well, she often affected electromagnetic, frequencies, tape recorders, radios, watches, all sorts of objects around her.
Right. They had architects, engineers, physicists, and physicians, nurses. They had a lot of different people try to figure this case out over many different years. And in fact, I found it interesting, Mr. Stern, that she actually went to, I was going to say the word asylum, but it's actually sanitarium.
Well, asylum has a loaded connotation. No, it was not a mental hospital.
No, it was
a sanitarium in the European sense, a place for recuperation
right.
and medical care if needed. But it was, that is the European sense of the word.
Right.
The Dr. Evgeniy Shkadola, who headed the research team, or one of the research teams in the course of this case, he thought it would be a good idea to isolate the girl from her family so that completely objective tests and experiments could be conducted without possible interference.
I wondered about doing something like that to a teenager, taking her away from her family to do all these weird tests on her.
Well, that's a good question. She probably wanted to go, as a kind of a break from her routine.
Right, as most teenagers would.
I don't think
get
she
away from their
objected to
parents.
that. And the researchers had her best interest at heart.
Yeah.
I think the family, the parents.
Well, they had her do all kinds of different, things. Suspended objects from a string.
All sorts of every type of experiment you could imagine to.
Had her move the objects, yeah, and had her do the cards with telekinesis, and they would have the card, and she would have to figure out what the card was, and she was right.
Telepathy test.
Yes.
Which she did pass. Like she guessed correctly, yes, 8 out of 12 cards on one occasion, and 8 out of 10 on another occasion, if I recall correctly. So
right.
That's the strange thing about this case. It wasn't just poltergeist activity.
Yeah.
There were other aspects that defy rational explanation. I mean, the duration, 7 years is unusual.
When they asked her about it, in her words, she replied that at the moment the tester, they would send her geometric figures written down on a piece of paper.
Yes.
And the I can't pronounce it, Manczarska, Manczarski test. So she said that the choice of the figures that she chose.
Manczarski test, I think you're talking
yes, yeah. That to her, in front of her, she said she chose them because in her own mind they would become larger, warmer, and more pleasant.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Yeah, so lots of other things happened. They did all kinds of tests on her. And then we talked about the telepathy or telepathic things.
I got another question.
Yeah, another question.
Did anyone in her family exhibit any kind of abilities themselves?
Good question. Mr. Stern, did anybody in the family have any other gifts?
They're not mentioned in the book, so I don't think so.
Not mentioned in the book?
No.
Yeah. I was one.
She was an only child. Her parents were simple, working class people.
Right.
Without any interest in the paranormal, or maybe even without any knowledge of it. It was a totally foreign part of their life.
Right.
So, to answer Mr. De Hoyos' question,
De Hoyos, yeah.
She was the only one in the family to exhibit strange abilities.
Okay. And you said, well, some in the book also, De Hoyos, the film was unexposed. The digital watch batteries discharged and radios and tape recorders malfunctioned around the teenager. us in the paranormal field, when we do investigations, sometimes that happens.
Well, so I've heard, so she did have tangible physical effects on her surroundings. No question about it.
Well, some of the criticisms, of course, were saying that people were suspicious that she was deliberately engaging in pranks, maybe, tricking people with magic somehow.
Well, let me reply to that criticism. It's a possibility. I can't rule that out. But let's consider the counter argument. This case went on for a period of 7 years.
Right.
It was studied for 40 months by several teams of highly experienced, reputable specialists in various fields. Please explain to me how a teenage girl without any training in magic or who never dabbled in occult practices, how she was able to pull this off
Right.
for such a long period.
And there was another.
If she was able, I'd like to see an explanation. People who make this criticize this as a fairy tale or a hoax, they cannot produce an explanation of how this ordinary working class teenage girl was able to dupe scientists, researchers, physicians, municipal authorities, teachers,
Police,
engineers, architects,
physicists.
for such a long period of time.
Now, there were some other weird things about animals. She said that she was fond of animals, but they appeared ill in her presence. Yoasha's first dog, her poodle, got sick a few weeks later after the initial kinetic manifestations and then died. And the dog exhibited specific behavior patterns just before the spontaneous movement of objects. The dog would curl up in a safe place, like sensing imminent danger. Now, Joe Hoyos, I thought that was kind of weird. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it just goes to show that.
It's a proven fact that animals have a certain range of perception.
Mr. Stern,
in many cases far exceeds our own.
Yeah,
there's no question that certain animals smell much better, see much better, hear much better. Look at bats, for example. Echolocation. So if animals were sensitive to these phenomena, obviously something was going on in their surroundings.
Now, Mr. Stern, I want to hear what Mr. De Hoyos has to say about that, because he deals a lot with cryptid creatures and things like that, and animals.
No, I'm going to echo what he says. I think animals are a little bit more in tune, a little bit more sensitive to their environment. And I think that was pretty good proof or evidence.
Agreeing with what you said,
Yeah, that they were able to pick up on that.
Humans are limited by their five senses. In the great majority of instances, we just cannot perceive what goes beyond those five senses.
Right.
There are exceptions, psychics like Edgar Casey, who were, the Bulgarian seer Vanga, who for some inexplicable reason are able to access a higher level of reality or parallel reality, whatever you wish to call it. But, mainstream science tends to discount or ignore these experiences because they can't be explained with, at our current stage of knowledge. This does not mean that these experiences do not occur. We just cannot explain them.
Right.
And that is exactly what we're dealing with in this particular instance.
Now, I did find it interesting, Mr. Stern, and also De Hoyos, that when she was in school, that kinetic effects rarely occurred because she said she was afraid of being reprimanded by her teacher.
Well, there were a couple of instances of telepathic communication in a falling vase
Yes.
in a classroom, but
And when her teacher was writing something on the blackboard, well,
right.
De Hoyos, so Yoasha had to go up and do some kind of equation on the board. And her teacher was mad because she couldn't do it or she wouldn't do it, but she wrote an answer down that was completely wrong. But then the teacher later figured out the answer she wrote on the board was the answer to the next question that she was going to ask the
Yes.
class.
No,
Oh,
that
nice.
isn't telepathy. What do you call it?
How weird is that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it happened. I have no reason to doubt the honesty of this teacher. I mean, if she said it, who am I to question it?
Yeah, like why would the teacher say that? Yeah, and then there was a lot of other weird things that she bent, like high tension cable.
Oh, I held one of those in my hand when I visited the family's apartment.
Right.
You can't believe how massive these things are. Solid steel covered by some sort of, plastic or I don't know what the substance is, but, it's bent like a bow. I could not budge that thing, 1/100th of an inch. It was totally inflexible.
Now
I mean, how these people who criticize spoon bending, as a hoax, well, can they twist a massive communication cable into the shape of a pretzel?
right, and they had some
Let's try it.
They had metal studies done by the director of the Institute of Metal and Welding Technology.
Metallurgy and welding technology, yes.
Yes, and
Yes.
they compiled a report that was submitted by the ministry, submitted to the Ministry of Health and Social Welfare, and they could not figure out how she had done that.
Well, she wasn't using a vise or any other type of equipment. She did it manually. This teenage girl bending a massive communication cable.
Yes, and I think they answered.
If there's a scientific explanation for that, I'm yet to hear of one.
And they interviewed the metal guy, the doctor who researched that, and he said
Laura Cheslock, the head of the metallurgical section there, I think, is that the person you're referring to?
Dr. Gadula?
Oh, he wasn't a metallurgist. He was head of the research team.
Okay.
He was a physician, a surgeon.
Yes.
So he had nothing to do directly with the metal bending experiment, except, he directed the girl to, go to the institute for study. Yeah.
Yeah, he helped with the biophysical studies. They tried different things with electricity to see if she could close a circuit, radio waves, different frequencies, but they couldn't figure it out. Yeah. And then they talked about the cerebellum, and particularly the frontal.
There was a very detailed discussion of the psychological experiments with her testing.
Right, with the red stimulus
there were
and
certain anomalies found in the functioning of her cerebral hemispheres. A pattern was found that resembled epilepsy, although the girl did not suffer from epilepsy, but there were certain similarities, in the functioning of the left versus the right hemisphere.
Right.
That may have a bearing on the origin of the phenomenon.
Yeah, they talked about the study of after images when looked upon the energy process occurring in the brain and hormonal anomalies like the level of dopamine in Yoasha's urine test out to be very low relative to the norm. So a lower level of the dopamine in the brain during an epileptic seizures, of course, and a higher level in the case of schizophrenia. But hers was really low. So she didn't have any epileptic phenomenon.
Well, the psychological testing that was administered did not find any, great deviation from the norm.
Right.
In her psychological makeup. So there was no one feature in her psychological profile that accounted for the origin of these psychokinetic effects. I mean, the scientists tried to arrive at a correlation of some kind, but they were unable to do so.
They did thermal studies, De Hoyos, and
What kind of studies?
the puzzling thermal spots they found were like fingers, toes, head, slightly above the solar plexus.
Foci of energy were found in our fingertips or toes, solar plexus, which again may correlate with the origin and nature of these effects, but how do you measure something like that?
Right.
We just don't have the equipment or the knowledge right now to arrive at a clear-cut, conclusion.
And then they measured the actual electrostatic charges on her skin, which were very high. But the problem was, in her case, like they weren't dissipated by grounding, because most people ground themselves somehow and discharge themselves. But there was an exception of a nurse whose charges were higher than Yoasha's, which is weird. Like if you wear a nylon sweater or a wool blouse, right, and stuff like that, you accumulate 30 to 40,000 volts of static electricity and emit sparks, right? Several centimeters. You ever like go in the bedroom and nighttime you can see the sparks on your bed? You know, you used to do that as a kid, right? I remember doing stuff like that. But I guess what we could do, I know we don't want to be here a long time. We're coming up almost on an hour mark. We can skip to the appendix. Can we do that? To the hypotheses?
That is a very technical part of the book.
It is very technical.
Difficulty in translating, obviously, because let me say for the benefit of the listening audience that I'm a translator. I don't have a background in physics or other sciences, nor am I a professional paranormal researcher. I have a keen interest in certain topics, such as time slips, reincarnation, UFOs, paleoarchaeology, and so forth. I'm not going to...
How about we just read the interview with Yoasha herself? I thought that was interesting. The summer of '83, they interviewed her, and she said, "I never know when they're going to happen. I'm not afraid of them anymore." She said, "You can get used to anything." And then, they talked to her some more, and they asked her some more things. But like when you were with her, did you get any odd feelings or senses about her being off, like mentally, or?
No, not at all. The only striking feature that's noticeable right away is her eyes, which are very striking if you look at her picture.
Right, the book, yeah.
She has very unusual eyes, but other than that, I wouldn't say that there's anything extraordinary.
Right, yeah, she actually went to nursing school. She was majoring in nursing, and she said she wanted to pursue a career in the field, and I think she even had a kid and was married, and then they lost...
She got married eventually and had 2 children.
Mm-hmm.
And
then they couldn't find out where she was after that.
Well, her parents passed away, and she kind of disappeared from the face of the earth.
But it was interesting during that time. A bunch of other people came out of the woodworks and said, "Oh, I can do it too," and "Oh, yeah, me too," and then they called it the mass hysteria theory, right?
Well, that's described in one of the chapters of the book. There seemed to be an outbreak of poltergeist and other paranormal activity.
And then water became materializing out of nowhere. And, I think about, all these movies, right? The spooky movies, right? The Hoyos, and they got like the water is there, and that's ectoplasm and stuff like that, right? I mean, I don't know. But when you go to the theories, now, some of them, I think, from a technical standpoint, I know you said, you're not technical.
I'm not qualified to judge the validity of any of these arguments, nor are the authors of the book. They're investigative journalists.
Right.
They tried to be objective and as complete as possible in their descriptions, but they leave it to the reader to reach his or
Now, another time they interviewed her in October, page 108, 87. She said, I got up after my parents left to work. She said, I noticed two of the room doors were missing. One had slipped out of the hinges. The other was resting against a cupboard. The metal grinder had climbed onto the dryer again, and glass kept shattering on the walls. And when she was in her freshman and sophomore years at school, the kinetic effects didn't occur while she was there. But during the last visit to her in '89, they interviewed her. They said, after 6 years, how do you feel about the phenomena you're still dealing with? She said, I accept them now. I'm used to the situation. Do they frighten you? She said, no, they amuse me.
Well, let me tell you something. They did not amuse her mother, who was a ball of nerves.
Right, yeah.
And several of her eyewitnesses, including friends who were conked in the head by flying objects, were not amused. So,
right. It says, have you ever tried to find a rational explanation for all this? She says, I don't think I'll ever think up anything on my own when people smarter than me have failed, nor do I want any publicity. Why should I? If this has to happen, I got to know how to live with it. Do you remember your dreams? Very seldom. I usually forget them right after I wake up. If I do remember one, it means something is about to happen. Do you want to work as a nurse? Yeah, she said, except I'd like to take a 2-year postgraduate medical. Do you think this is a suitable profession for you? She says, yeah, contact with sick people suits me. I want to help them. So there wasn't very many interviews with her, but there were the few. But I thought it was interesting when she said, no, they amuse me. And then when she talked about the doors missing and things, it almost made you kind of scratch your head and go, right? But then when the physicists started talking about things, I thought that was really interesting. I know the part in the appendices, like the biogravitational powers and stuff like that, when you talk about gravity, is interesting.
Well, the girl clearly affected gravity in her presence in some inexplicable way.
Well, they say, biomagnetic energy. Energy forces are activated in girls during puberty. In particular, they say changes occurring in the body's cells produce the bioengineered field, and the energy source is the splitting of the chromes. And after puberty, they say these forces usually disappear. And we talked about that before. But maybe is it Occam's razor? Like the simple, almost explanation is usually the right one.
Well, let me put it this way. I'm not quite sure that there's a single explanation that accounts for all cases of poltergeist activity. Conceivably, there could be some malicious entity that, brings this into existence.
Well, they talked about etheric energy.
Conceivably, I'm not saying that in her case this happened.
Marvelous channel, it says.
There are some researchers. There's a split in the paranormal community between those who prefer rational, science-based explanation and those who are more, let's say, inclined to ascribe these phenomena to
astral planes,
supernatural influences.
Mm-hmm.
The book was reviewed in the Australian Journal of Parapsychology. I think it was back in December or January. And the reviewer has a strictly spiritualist approach. He discounts all the scientific research. He said if a well-trained medium had been brought in, this case could have been resolved right away. There wouldn't have been no psychokinesis, no other untoward destructive effects. So there are still those who subscribe to this supernatural hypothesis. I see no reason to accept it in this particular instance. The girl had no experience of occult, doctrines, or she showed no interest in witchcraft or such things. So why did this, if there was an entity, why did it come down and, invade test? Did it bend metal for it? I mean, it can't possibly explain all the occurrences that are described in the book.
Right.
I mean, but is there one ultimate cause for each poltergeist?
Well, they talk about,
I don't know. I can't say there is or isn't. I just don't know, and Frank, I don't think anybody can assert with confidence that there is a single cause.
Right. And when we go to Einstein's theory of relativity, they say that model of physics in this day and age is long considered remarkable, and that's what we're supposed to abide by. But now people are beginning to prove that it's inadequate for understanding or interpreting the phenomena that physics and physicians and are dealing with today, especially with the Hadron Collider. And, we're talking about different theories when it comes to gravity and how that works. And that portion, like when you read all that, when it talks about that in the appendix, like over on page 116, like inertial masses and gravitational mass and stuff like that, I mean, that makes you really scratch your head. And because they talk about different planes and how different like beings might be able to come from like parallel worlds and universes, and they talk about all that kind of stuff, which is really interesting. But that they're trying to say that the spectrum is infinite, like that. Basically, the theory of relativity really, it's like an ancient thought, that we need to get with the program.
I think that's the true value of this particular book. It's not just one curious case of psychokinesis that happened 40 years ago. So what? Who cares? I think it raises questions about the nature of reality and consciousness. That these questions are still relevant, and I think this particular book makes a contribution to this entire issue.
Yeah.
Nature of reality. And I should mention that the co-authors Marek and Anna, 6 years later, wrote a book titled "The Return of the Elusive Force," which describes a truly spectacular case of psychokinesis involving a comatose patient in a Warsaw hospital. This individual was apparently suffered from acute alcohol intoxication, and he was brought in, in a comatose state, and all of a sudden these violent, destructive psychokinetic effects started occurring, which were witnessed by the physicians, and nurses, the entire staff of the hospital. And the authors of the book also witnessed these phenomena personally.
Interesting.
Now, I think we can give them a degree of credence. These were trained observers. I have no reason to doubt their credibility. I hope that one day this book, the second book, The Return of the Elusive Force, will be translated. I don't know if I'll ever get around to it, but it's certainly a valuable follow-up.
Yeah, well, thanks for translating the book and getting it out there. It was a very interesting read, and I think the appendix to me was the most interesting when you get into the physics of it, like when they talk about parallel times and spaces and dimension and the theory of relativity and quarks and all kinds of different things like that. And if you like that kind of stuff and you're into philosophy and physics, well, yeah, that's an interesting thing to read.
Well, philosophy and physics nowadays intersect.
Yeah, definitely.
The ancient Vedas, with our philosophical treatises are held in great respect by many physicists. Robert Oppenheimer quoted something from a Sanskrit book when he witnessed the first atomic explosion. So you're absolutely right. This is the intersection of philosophy and physics.
For sure.
Yes.
So before we peace out today, Mr. De Hoyos, do you have any other questions for Mr. Stern before we go?
No, but it was good talking to him, and I like the fact that he was talking about that whatever abilities that she had, whether they were supernatural, paranormal, I did like that he brought that up because I was kind of thinking that, I mean, there's no way to know for sure, but I was kind of like thinking that maybe something was working through her. That was just my opinion.
Yeah, he was thinking that maybe something was working through her, like astrally on a different astral plane or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
You never know. I mean, there's so many different entities that we don't know about that work through light and things like that. We talked a little bit about that last night with Chucky. But yeah, so Mr. Stern, before you go, do you want to give a shout out on where people can follow you and find you? And then we'll have Mr. De Hoyos give a shout out to himself also.
Well, I don't have a website, but I'd be glad to pass on my email if it's okay.
Yeah, that's up to you if you want to do that. Go ahead.
Joel Deco Stern at gmail.com.
Okay. Yeah. And if
JoelDecostern at gmail.com.
Okay,
I'd be
perfect.
glad to answer any questions or to refer them to the co-author Anna Sitskin Warsaw. As I mentioned, I'm not a scientist or a paranormal researcher, so I can't give you definitive answers to all these issues, but I can certainly give you my opinion
Right.
and refer you to people who are more knowledgeable than I.
Well, we really appreciate you being on the show today and explaining the book. And, it was really interesting you meeting her and talking about that too. And I'll let Mr. De Hoyos give some shout outs on where people can find him and his work.
Yeah, you can find me anywhere on any social media platform. You can type in Joe De Hoyos or type in Beyond the Woodline and you'll find me. My shows are primarily on Mondays, but every now and then, like this week, I'm going to have a couple of shows on this coming Sunday. So, yeah, you guys tune in and check out the show. I'm on YouTube and Spotify and, of course, Facebook.
Everybody follow Joe De Hoyos and follow also Joel Stern. You won't be disappointed. I'll go ahead and put their socials up in the link. And I want to thank you both for being on today. Thank you again so much, Mr. Stern.
It was a lot of fun. Jen, please, when the show is edited,
Yes.
when you finish editing it, please send it to me by email and an attachment so I can pass it on to my friends.
Okay.
And if you bring it out on Facebook as well, I'll certainly send it to my Facebook.
Oh, for sure. I'll email you and I'll put a link up there on your messenger.
It would be wonderful.
Okay. It was very nice to meet you, Mr. Stern. Thank you.
Likewise. Take care. You have a great evening.
You too. Bye-bye. Thanks for going through that, Joe. I know it was kind of awkward the way we had to do it technologically here today because Mr. Stern isn't on social media really. So we just did a phone call with him. So it's always good to have another person there, especially who didn't read the book, knows nothing about the book. So to give like that, different perspective on it, which was, I don't know, I'm still kind of skeptical, shall we say, but some of the stuff was really weird, like,
Yeah, some of the stuff he was saying, it really kind of like, I mean, I just don't know what to think, because like I said, I do believe in this stuff, but I am a skeptic about it.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking was like, I was wondering if something was working through her, and who knows why these entities do this, it seems like they pick people at random, or
Especially, kids who are maybe
yeah.
having a hard time because it says her mom had issues with anxiety. But I mean, if stuff was flying around my house, I think I'd have issues too.
Yeah,
But
I have
even,
some issues too,
yeah, even if she knew how to do magic, some of the stuff that was happening was just so weird. Like I'd have to go through and read over them for you. But like there's no reason for any person to come forward and say these things who were such high credible people. It was just, I don't know why somebody would do that unless they wanted to get on a show or be publicized or something like that. But so your next show is coming on Sunday, is it?
Well, I'm actually recording tonight. I'll be on tonight, and then but Sunday I'll have two shows on Sunday at noon, and then again at 6 p.m.
Okay, well, make sure everybody tune in and watch Joe De Hoyos, and he's the host of Beyond the Woodline Podcast. And I'll go ahead and put your info up in the bottom there. I'm going to peace out. We'll just do a quick wrap up. I'm going to end the recording. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in.